All right, we are starting our fourth and final chapter of Church History 101. This one entitled the Modern Church. And we will do the first half today, the second half with its more personal take next week, and then we will be done with this book. So this is in many ways kind of a summation chapter that is intended to both catch us up to the present while connecting the various threads as they have been, kind of pointed out over the last few eras and the last few classes. So the first thing that I want to unpack very briefly is a technical term, and that is the word modern. We use the word modern and contemporary interchangeably, and that's not actually correct. The modern era is often, it's got kind of a fluid definition. But by and large, most the ways that historians distinguish various eras, the modern era ended sometime in the 20th century. It could be in the 50s or 60s. It could be even at World War I. But we still use modern. Oh, that's modern. This is modern. And that's actually kind of referring to something a little more specific than something that is, we tend to use it to say like advanced or cutting edge or present day or future looking. And the era that we are currently in is still up for grabs, although postmodern is often kicked around philosophically. But that's the reason why, if you're like starting off this chapter and it begins with a timeline starting off in 1700, but it's called the modern church. Like, wait a second, modern, with the, how modern is your church if you're wearing a tricorn hat and your flintlock musket? But that is to say that what we would consider kind of the Enlightenment period flows into the modern era, which is a little more coterminous with the Industrial Revolution. So the modern era is kind of an era of both scientific exploration and, I would say, like scientific application, using the methods of science that were kind of burgeoning in the Enlightenment period. As the Renaissance moves into its next phase, I think we would generally call that the Enlightenment. And this is where some of the philosophers that get mentioned early on in the chapter are going to pop up. The Locke's and the Rousseau's and those kind of folks who are taking a lot of the knowledge and skills and philosophical growth of the Renaissance and the Reformation period, and now they are looking for ever new ways to apply it. And so we move kind of, Renaissance, Enlightenment, and then we're moving into, the Industrial Age and the Modern Age. So, folks who are older than me will have a more clear memory, I think, of the vestiges of modernity, as we talk about as an age, where there were several decades, if not longer, in here in America, just kind of understood. There's just assumptions, as well as within the pop culture, that we were in the process of figuring everything out. And that if you applied scientific thought to any problem, you could come up with the right solution. That problem wasn't just, maybe mathematical or chemical. That problem could be interpersonal. That problem could be cultural. That problem could be societal. And so you have, various social programs that, medical science is pushing for, all you really need to do is to use science, and you will come up with the right answer, because this method of systematically approaching things is going to yield not just knowledge, but the correct answer. And the reason why I said people maybe a little older than me, people who could remember the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s differently than I could just reading about them, where as I read about them, there seems to be a very palpable sense of experts will tell us what to do. That whatever field of interest we're talking about, there was an expert, maybe a professor or a scientist in a lab coat or whatever, and they were going to give us the right answer, and then we were going to learn how to do the right answer, and then things would be better. We were going to solve problems. That could be something as simple as, especially in psychology, when you have behaviorists like Skinner or psychoanalysts like Freud or Jung, where there was a real sense of, we are just about ready to figure out all of the mysteries of human thought. We're super close to kind of categorizing everything, making it work, and then fixing it forever. And then in kind of a pop psychology way, this is where self-help books are now produced. I'm not going to say for the first time, because there's always been a market for people, offering experienced suggestion. But suddenly there were these expert opinions on every facet of your life, saying that if you just, you did these systematic steps, stuff would not only be better, but they would, we're like nearing perfection almost. Child rearing books have existed for a long time, but like there was a whole generation that was influenced by Dr. Spock, and stuff like that, especially specific authors are almost completely forgotten now. Though at the time it was sort of like, this is revolutionizing something that humanity has done for thousands of years. But there's like this assurance, this self-assurance, like we really got this. And the reason why a lot of historians or social psychologists, whatever, distinguish between the modern era and the postmodern era is the postmodern era kind of circles back around to a new skepticism of, I don't know that we can figure anything out. The 30s, 40s, 50s, and even into the 60s, I think there was this, not just optimism, but almost an assumption. Scientific progress is leading us to utopia. And then the postmodern era is really saying, we're still in a mess, and maybe things are even getting worse. And those are very different assumptions about the nature of the world or society or humanity, and they kind of nicely help distinguish these major eras. So the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on the dignity and the sovereignty of the person. And then with the Industrial Revolution, where now the scientific method kind of pioneered through the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment, is now operating in large scale. And we've got mechanisms and machinery that automate things, that allow for everything from major changes in agricultural production to shipping and distribution to locomotives and cars and engines and, and then, moving on to even more technology with transistors and computers and all that kind of stuff. But still, the idea that applied thinking, applied science is going to solve problems. And in many ways it does, and in many ways it has. But it sort of led, I think, an entire era of people to believe that we were just steps away from an end goal solution, rather than there maybe isn't an end goal in sight. We can continue to make progress in something maybe technological or whatever, but we don't actually, we're not close to solving some sort of fundamental reality of society or nature. This era then of modernity, again, Renaissance, Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, modernity, they're all kind of flowing together in this era that we're talking about in our chapter, is going to then have these very major repercussions on the state of the church, on denominations, on the spread of the gospel. It seems like a super big spread to talk about a singular era and a singular chapter where we go from Spanish missionaries in South America to, yesterday. I mean, those kind of feel like worlds apart in many ways, but that is the way this book, at least, has kind of spread out this time period and tried to find the kind of the connective ideas that are then going to be filtered out into all the various, events and notable occasions of these last basically 300 years. It's a pretty big spread. So by the end of our section, it's going to take a super Roman Catholic turn, which is maybe less informative than it could be otherwise. But like the last few pages are talking about inside baseball of the Roman Catholic Church that is probably very helpful if you're a Roman Catholic. But if we're talking about church history or even Western church history in general, it glosses over kind of a lot. So the next section is going to help bridge a few of those gaps, but still, this modern era is going to see a real decline in the predominance of Roman Catholicism. That's not to say it ever goes away. That's not to say it isn't still, the largest Christian body in the world, because it is, and in the West, and it is. And yet, the seeds of decline that were sowed in the Reformation period, that were sowed even earlier as the rise of the nation states sees the church and its bishops or the Pope as, instead of being overarching and connecting all societies, being kind of like rival rulers, that what has now continued to grow out of that is a further fracturing and splintering of the church, and a contraction of Roman Catholicism into basically what it is today. You talk to a Roman Catholic theologically, and they'll talk about the universal church and the visible and invisible church and all that kind of stuff. The practical reality is it's like a denomination like any other. It's the biggest one by far, but what is the practical difference, between the cultural impact of Roman Catholicism versus the Anglicans or the Methodists or the Southern Baptists? And it's all really a degree of scale. One is not a different thing than the others. We can say it has a lot or a little, but it's all kind of the same thing now. And that's going to be a real hallmark of this entire age, is kind of the flattening of the various broken pieces of the church. And so to circle back around, these Enlightenment philosophies about the sovereignty and the dignity of the individual, I think we can see how that would play kind of directly into this. It was a phrase that I mentioned last time that, again, I just heard this somewhere. It's probably very old and maybe it's even famous, but we replaced one pope with a million popes. And that's kind of the idea that is, it takes root in the Reformation and it blooms and bears fruit in modernity and in our contemporary age. That basically everyone is the captain of their soul. And that is a very Enlightenment idea. That's not to say that people weren't identified as individuals before, but there was a communal or tribal or cultural connection that I think was probably so difficult to tease out from your identity as an individual that it just wasn't done. Like you understood yourself as not yourself. You were a part of a family, a part of a tribe, a part of a community, a part of a village, a part of a language group, a cultural group, a nation, a subject to a king, whatever. Like all of these things are kind of they're all sort of packaged together, or they're all kind of linked. And in the Enlightenment and into modernity, it's as though I could find like a loose string on your clothing that you think you can just kind of pop off and it'll just look better and nicer, but you start tugging on it and all of a sudden it starts unraveling. No, this giant hole. So, we were playing with these loose strings and now all those pieces have kind of unraveled. Without judgment of saying one is better or worse than the other, it's different to understand yourself in this, what we might call an atomized, like an atom, in this atomized way. We are not so much members of a family or a tribe or a nation or any of these kind of things. We're us. And I mean, honestly, there's quite a lot of good to be said for that. This dignity of every human being that has now worked its way explicitly into our baptismal covenant, is I think the phraseology is very Enlightenment. But I mean, I'll say the sentiment and the intent is very biblical. It's very scriptural. But how that is applied, how that is expressed, is going to be understood in light of the fact that we have no singular overarching church authority that says this is what this means and this is what that means. Every single person now, even faithful Roman Catholics, have to make a decision about what they're going to believe and who they're going to trust. This is different, I wasn't thinking about this chapter when I was preaching on Sunday, but there's kind of an overlap there, where I was talking some about the gracious gift of choice, and that there is a difference. We are not our own, we are bought for a price. That was in our epistle reading from 1 Corinthians. When you are fully under something or someone's authority, you don't really make a lot of decisions or choices. You just do what you're told, in essence. But once you are out of that authority or out of that structure, or no longer a slave or a servant, then suddenly you can do the same thing as you did before. Like the actions or activities could be the same, but you have to choose them. Because now who is telling you what to do? Nobody. Or you are even if somebody tells you, you have to decide, am I going to do it or not? Small children, we still train in school to raise their hand and to say, may I use the restroom, please, or whatever, and get the hall pass or get the whatever and go use the bathroom. Now, if I'm in a meeting, I don't raise my hand and say, Bishop Justin, may I go to the restroom, please? First of all, it would be weird and I would be disruptive to the meeting. Second of all, I am not a child. If I need to go to the bathroom, I'm just going to go to the bathroom. And if that makes you mad, then that's kind of your problem. You're the weird one, not me. But now that I am an adult and I'm kind of responsible for that, if me getting up to go to the bathroom is disruptive to an important event, well, now that's my fault. And so I then make choices, maybe hopefully mature choices, where I'm kind of, okay, I'm feeling a need to go to the bathroom. Does it have to be right this second? It looks like they're in the middle of something. Maybe I can wait to a break. Okay, I can't wait to the break, but maybe I can wait for a moment where it wouldn't be distracting for me to get up. Am I sitting in a place that everybody's going to notice, or can I slip out quietly? All these sorts of things where I am now choosing what I'm going to do, how I'm going to behave or act. Whereas as a child, for good or for bad, you see some of these kids who they start squirming and doing the potty dance and the ants in the pants and stuff like that. And, or they'll forget what they're doing and maybe it'll be too late. And now you got to clean up the chair. The idea being when it is an understood and an unquestioned assumption that the hierarchy of the church is the hierarchy of the church and the Pope is the Pope and this is the faith and this is what we have received, you're not asking or answering a lot of these questions because it's not a question at all. It's a statement. It's a fact. But suddenly everything is up for grabs. The church is now an option. The faith is now a maybe. The Pope is just one of many. And now every person has to make choices about what they're going to believe and what they're going to do. Even if that's to say, yes, I believe the Pope and I will be under his authority as a faithful Roman Catholic, whatever he says goes, at some point, you still make that choice and you didn't used to. 800 years ago, that was not a choice that you made to follow the Pope or not. It was what it was. So again, these things that kind of, they start in the Reformation and Renaissance period, they become applied a lot more explicitly in the Enlightenment, and then through the Industrial Age and now the modern age and beyond. It's like we don't even realize how much of a consumer model that we have when it comes to faith and churches. And again, I say that not to critique it necessarily, but to just note the difference. I think there are many positives, many things that are beneficial to that dignity of the individual. And these are being worked out through these time frames. Remember early on in this time frame, this is where the Pope had drawn a line in the New World to say this side Spain can have and that side Portugal can have. And it doesn't matter who already lived there. It doesn't matter if they thought that land was theirs or they thought that gold was theirs or whatever. You are now free, Spain and Portugal, to divide this stuff under the line that I have set and do what you're going to do. Are the indigenous people that they find in whatever location worth the same as you are? Are they a lesser being? Do they have the same, moral responsibilities that you do? Do they have the same human potential that you do? Are they more like animals, or are they more like brothers? And these are decisions that are getting worked out and sometimes changed over the course of hundreds of years. In many ways, the world is still, very, very deeply impacted as Western Europe spreads in its influence throughout the rest of the globe. This time frame will be the rise of empires. There had always been empires, but never before had they been so far flung, because there was no way to do that. Your empire, the Persians, massive empire. The Mongols, maybe the largest by land area empire in history. But it's like you conquer this land and then you ride your horse to the next one, conquer that one, and you walk to the next one, you conquer that. Everything is like touching. It's like the continental US 48 contiguous states. In the age of empire, because of shipbuilding technology, navigational technology, all of these things that, cartography and astronomy. Now we can have an America that exists thousands of miles of ocean away in a Hawaii, or way up past most of Canada and in Alaska. Now empire can mean something that's nowhere near you. And the only way to get from here to there is to cross an ocean. People who are so completely and radically different than you. And that's a different way of building and conquering in an empire than the world had seen before, because it lacked the ability to do it. Well, now that it had the ability to do it, these are some of the things that we see. So this era then is struggling with how to apply these principles of individual dignity and sovereignty. You are a worthwhile individual and you make choices for yourself, and that is right and proper. This still had a very deeply, religious and faithful underpinning. All of these things we're talking about, I think, are eminently defendable throughout Scripture. As a matter of fact, from the beginning, we were made in the image of God. So to be able to talk about individuality and dignity and sovereignty, I mean, this is nothing that's created new or created out of nothing. But the way it's being applied is pretty new and it's pretty radical. And this is very much no matter who you are, where you're from, and what family you were born in, you are worth the same as a person as anybody else. And maybe that shouldn't be such a radical thought, but at the time it certainly was. With our last chapter talking about the continued rise of the nation states and the rival kings and princes and the church and the pope, and they're just kind of like another rival kingdom or whatever. And a lot of emphasis on how can I unite my kingdom, because it's not just easier to rule, it is more stable if we are all like on the same team. So let's speak the same language. Let's have the same church. Let's give ourselves a name. This is why, various smaller duchies and principalities become France. This is why Wessex and Sussex and Northumbria eventually become England. So the push of unifying, and now here's this very interesting pushback of atomizing. I'm a member of this nation, and maybe I have a king. But what's most important about me is that I'm me and not you. What's most significant about me is who I am, not what I am in relation to others or a nation. This is a profound game changer in everything from society to government. Imagine the difference in laws when it's not about your obedience to a king. It is about who you are individually and the choices that you make and the choices that society as a whole has made through those individuals cooperating together. The consent of the governed. This is different and this is new. And these principles, as they are carried out through the American Revolution, through the French Revolution, are now spilling over into the life of the church, the Roman Catholic Church, but all churches and denominations. Because if we're going to talk about, a government is only there through the consent of the governed. Government is not ordained by God to simply exist forever, but it's because we choose to cooperate and we choose to together make this framework that we can all exist in. Then why doesn't that work in the church? Shouldn't that work in the church too? Shouldn't we be able to say how the church is run? Shouldn't I get a vote? I go to church here. This is very different. Instead of coming from on high or coming from councils or coming from the top down, suddenly everything is kind of up to the vote. And even churches and denominations are being changed, being led, being adjusted by popular opinion. If we don't like this and we're all in agreement, we change it. That's different, very different. The chapter, because again, it gets super Roman Catholic at the end, talks about the American Revolution and, there's no more English king. And so the Catholics want a bishop and they petition to the Pope and he says, basically, you can pick your own, at least for this one time, and it's one time. But then after that, it reverts back to the church hierarchy, picking its own bishops and formulating who's going to do what and where. Well, let's make it a little more personal to us. Throughout the American colonies, the Church of England was predominant. It wasn't the only denomination or religious faction, but depending on which colony you were in, it was overwhelmingly Anglican in, say, Virginia, not as much in Massachusetts or Maryland. But if you say you're in New York, by and large, Church of England. So the 13 colonies throw off the authority of England, and now it is a new American nation. Can you really go to a Church of England church? Maybe we have to rethink this. So the loyalists leave, but those who are left behind, well, what are we going to do with our church? And how are we going to find new clergy? How are we going to make decisions? How are we going to lead this church if we were getting our instructions, if we were getting our stability, if we are getting our ordinations from an English hierarchy that we have now just cut off? And so the former Church of England churches, for the most part, kind of banded together and reorganized as the Episcopal Church. And that's where we come from. Episcopal, in this sense, meaning governed by a bishop, that we very purposely chose to not have a hierarchy above the level of bishop. There's no archbishops in the Episcopal Church. There's no pope in the Episcopal Church. Even the role of the presiding bishop is way bigger now than it was before. It used to be simply the bishop who presided over meetings. Like somebody needed to hit the gavel and say when we start and when we stop. And so they typically gave it to the oldest guy there. And that's what the presiding bishop was. Whoever the oldest was, you do it. Hey, Bob, you're older than I am, right? You do it. And that's all it was for quite some time. But there's some pretty interesting history behind how we got our first two bishops, Samuel Seabury and William White. And basically connections that we have to sending somebody over to get consecrated by Scottish non-jurors or other English bishops to try to preserve the apostolic episcopal succession of the laying on of hands through church leadership and not having a clean split and a break and saying we're restarting from scratch, but to say, no, we're in continuity, not just with the English church that went before, but with the universal church that went back to the apostles. We have to figure out a way to do that. And in doing that and setting up a structure that can then be sustained. The Episcopal Church was organized by the same American founders who wrote the Articles of Confederation, which eventually gave way to the Constitution. But if you look at the way that the United States government was set up in the Articles of Confederation, and then you look at the structure of the Episcopal Church, it's going to look super similar. Why? Because it was the same guys. It was the same guys who said, well, this is how our new nation is going to run. This is how these formerly connected but relatively independent colonies can now coexist as a nation. And under the Articles of Confederation, if you remember some of your U.S. history, the individual states had a lot of sovereignty, had a lot of individual power, and there's a lot of distinction between the states. They cooperated as a whole, but you weren't an American so much as you were a Virginian, for instance. And you would have your own currency, maybe, or you would have your own laws, maybe. Stuff would be very distinct going from state to state early on, and the Articles of Confederation found a way for them to try to cooperate together without doing a lot to standardize things from state to state. Turned out to be kind of a weakness, kind of a problem when there were so many currencies running around, and how do we solve arguments and disagreements between two states? How do we know who's actually in charge? What happens when we need to have a treaty with France? Who actually has the authority to do that? Stuff like that eventually is resolved through a constitution and our checks and balances and our, 3 branches of government, all that kind of stuff. But, early on, the Articles of Confederation, where there's a lot of independence still between the original 13 states, and there is a unicameral legislature. There is just like Congress is just one elected group of people, and that's it. And there's no executive branch, there's no president, there's no court, none of that. There's just Congress. We only have a House of Bishops, or we've got a House of Deputies, which are lay people and priests, deacons, and we have the House of Bishops. And the two of them are now a little closer to the Constitutional Senate and House of Representatives. But the idea is we have no executive branch. We have no judicial branch. Everything is only handled through the legislature. Now, we could call that a quirk of having the same people around at the same time when you had two different things that needed to be done. Okay, we've got a new nation. We've got to write some laws and we got to organize ourselves. Oh, we have a new church. We have to write some laws. We have to organize ourselves. And you can say it's kind of coincidental that the same people happen to be the same time, but in reality, we're getting back to this Enlightenment sense of we are figuring this out, and the vote of the person, their dignity, their sovereignty, their choice. This is of supreme importance. Why wouldn't you structure a church the same way you structure a national government? Why wouldn't you give a voice and a vote to the people? Why wouldn't you all come together, debate, argue, and then put in your ballot as to the law of the nation or the doctrine of a church? And so there was just sort of an assumption that this is how it ought to be done, whether we're writing the Articles of Confederation or whether we are formulating how the Episcopal Church is going to exist. And so in many ways, what we've inherited is a really direct outgrowth of this Enlightenment understanding and in this time frame. So we move then from the Enlightenment into the industrial age, and now stuff is machines are being built and large scale automation and cities are now becoming more important. When you think we'll talk, I think we'll get into a little bit more about how demographics have shifted because of this, but understand that before you basically had villages and you had farms, and that was kind of it. And villages were relatively small, and as they grow into cities, you still have the city, and then you had farms, or just nothing, wilderness. But this concept of populations moving into a smaller location because that's where the stuff is. That's where the support structure is. That's where the money is. That's where the jobs are. That's where the shops are. That's where the government is located, and all these other sorts of things is a very significant and substantial change. Not just within society as a whole, but that's going to be deeply influential in the church as well. We're moving from this time less of a conglomeration of very small pieces into a few much, much larger ones. So rather than having a tiny little church or a tiny little village or the person who goes from place to place to place because it's just scattered people over a wide area, with industrialization and we have a factory. Factories need people, and people have to live close to the factory. Now we build big buildings that house people and so on and so forth. Well, now maybe there's just a central church that's going to cover all of those folks. Or if we have multiple denominations, they all kind of start gravitating to the same place. And now you've got a church on every corner, and they're all different, but they're all kind of close in together because that's where the people have gone. Now, to get from here to there, we still have a wide open expanse, especially in the new world of the Americas, North and South, where through both the European colonization and the eventual westward expansion, you have the one of the greatest time periods of evangelism through missionary work that we will see in all of church history. Again, the technology that is allowing people to travel to places they could not have gone before. The ability to take a ship from one nation, sail an ocean, and get to another one, and to do so reliably was a complete game changer. But what that's also done is open up the opportunity for evangelism. And so churches, it's hard to call it the church anymore, but just to say churches are now sending people out into brand new areas where people have never experienced the gospel before in order to preach and to teach and evangelize. That's happening from crossing an ocean and going to a brand new nation. And that's happening, in the westward expansion of the United States, where missionaries are now traveling further and further afield, encountering new tribes that they had not ever met before. And there is there's a really interesting kind of convergence of some of the application of the philosophy we've been talking about. Because if the individual is of importance and dignity and sovereignty, then reaching them with the gospel gains a new level of significance. The person in some faraway land who has never heard the gospel, under this new Enlightenment philosophy, is just as important as I am and should have every opportunity to hear the gospel and to hear it in their own language and to hear it in a way they're going to understand it. I do like the fact that the chapter mentioned this, some of the complexities within the missionary movement of explaining the gospel in a culture that had a lot less overlap to your culture than they were used to. That doesn't sound too tricky until you try to do it in practical terms. For instance, how do you explain Jesus as the good shepherd to a culture that's never seen a sheep? You know, it sounds kind of silly to put it in those terms. Like, well, you just come up with the next best thing. You know, every culture has some sort of herding animal. So you just say, well, he doesn't have sheep, but you guys have, you know, I don't know, you have caribou or whatever, and you gather your caribou and you follow them during the migration season, stuff like that. So, you know, Jesus isn't the good shepherd, Jesus is the caribou wrangler. And that helps get across a general point, but there may be other elements of it that you don't anticipate that are quite different. Like the life of a caribou wrangler, I've never done it before, but then again, I've never really been a shepherd, might have some pretty substantial differences between the shepherd metaphor that's kind of all throughout the Old Testament and New, and it might pop up in ways that you don't expect. When do you start changing the message so substantially that you might be causing problems? You know, I've had occasion recently to bring up, a few times the fact that growing up in Orlando meant not only had I never seen snow personally, but the concept of winter was very abstract. I knew that there was a winter, and in school, you know, we like cut out snowflakes and stuff from the, you know, you fold a piece of paper and you cut the shit, but like, it was completely abstract to me. I mean, I'm doing it, you're telling me it's a snowflake. Sure, it's a snowflake. What's a snowflake? You know, I could read about it. I might see snowfall on a TV show, but I never actually encountered a real snowflake. I never understood leaves changing of fall, you know, little things like that. I was, again, this sounds very silly, but I was in my mid-20s in seminary before I experienced the start of spring. And in Swanee, there were daffodil bulbs everywhere, but you couldn't see them. It was cold, wet, and gray for 3 months, and there was just like what looks like dead trees and dead leaves everywhere. And then suddenly, out of just dead brown nothing, you would see these green stalks shoot up, and they would be everywhere. And within a week, what was nothing would start to blossom into this beautiful, bright yellow flower. And it was really cool to see. And I could have explained to you the nature of spring. I would have, it's not that I didn't have any context, but I'd never really seen it. I just took it on faith that it happened for other people. So again, you're trying to bring the gospel and you're trying to bring it in a substantial, life-changing way, because this is a life-changing message, and you, with your God-given dignity and the sovereignty of your person, is worth giving this message to so you too can be saved. But how do I do it if you and we barely communicate? And even as I'm learning your language, I'm constantly trying to figure out illustrations and metaphors that make sense to you, because your life and your culture and your geography are just so different than anything else that I know. Now, this has obviously happened over the course of the millennia. You know, rural England is not all that much like Jerusalem. I mean, in many ways, they're extremely different. But again, I'm going to kind of pull it back to that sense of ancient empire versus, you know, kind of Enlightenment modern empire. That when you conquer your neighbor and then your neighbor's neighbor, it's almost like color gradient, where maybe you seem like how they make a colored image and it sort of fades. Like it's real dark red in the center, but as it expands, it gets a little lighter, a little lighter, a little lighter, a little lighter, and then and it kind of just sort of dissolves into a different color, or white or clear, or whatever it is. And so your neighbor might be different than you, but they're not like radically different. You still have a lot of overlap just because of geographical proximity. And then once you take over your neighbor's neighbor, well, he's even more different than you, but he's not as different from your neighbor. So it's like it's changing, but it's changing more subtly. But now imagine you cross an ocean and out of nowhere, you come up with a culture and a land that's never seen you before. You have no connection to whatsoever. And you've never seen mountains and they have mountains, or you've never seen palm trees and they have palm trees, and you know, whatever it might be. So the change, I think, is having to deal with the kind of radical split between one group and another that maybe was a lot more subtle, like the change in color gradient, because you're going from neighborhood to neighborhood. And even as it changes just a little each time, as opposed to you're not going A, B, C, D, E, F, G in a line. You just skipped from A to X. And that's a pretty big difference. And it's a pretty big distance. The church then and its faith is being very contextualized, we could say. It takes root in a new nation, in a new people group, in a new tribe or a new area, and it begins to take on hallmarks of them, their experiences, their understandings. That has always been the case. You know, beautiful Renaissance portraits of biblical scenes that we're either personally familiar with, or we could see and just sort of say, oh, that's very beautiful. You know, Jesus was not a pale-skinned, blue-eyed Northern European, but we've seen plenty of, you know, examples in European art because they are expressing it through their culture. Well, these more indigenous cultures are then receiving the gospel and they're trying to express it in a way that makes sense to them. And so things get shaped and things get adjusted or whatever within that own context. And it's still that way in many degrees. There is a great unifying factor of the liturgy, for instance, especially the Book of Common Prayer. But we can go from Episcopal church to Episcopal church in this diocese and get some pretty different services, let alone going to an Anglican church in Kenya, where they have a Book of Common Prayer too. It's a little bit different than ours, but they come from the same place that we do. We can say we're all Anglicans, but the way they do the service is like, it's really different. And this is, again, it's both an outgrowth of this Enlightenment consideration of the dignity and the sovereignty, but it's also as the church and as the faith then naturally uses the circumstances of the day, whether that's technological innovation, new explorations, or whatever, to then try to fulfill the Great Commission and allow brand new people who have never discovered the gospel to not only meet Jesus, but to become discipled in a way that's going to be a little different than it happened to you or to people from somewhere else. And that is the church in many ways that we simply see today. In our own denomination, in our own diocese, in our own deanery, we have these unique peculiarities that are really an outgrowth of the era in which we live. How that applies and how we've made these decisions and some of the things that we've done with it. That's how we're going to end off next week and finish off from the Church in the Pews portion of our chapter. But as best as possible, trying to hit these big ticket worldwide historical things. Again, I said that modernity ended sometime in the 20th century. Who you ask, you get different takes on it. Most people will peg it no later than the 60s. One of the biggest reasons for it is the culmination of modernity through industrial scale, mechanized world warfare. You know, when you have a whole generation shaped by World War I and then World War II, which is the outgrowth of our scientific method can solve all problems. And I want us to think about that for good or for bad. They can solve problems of how to kill people in a more effective and efficient manner, how to mobilize and mechanize troops as quickly as possible, all the way to the truly diabolical, the eugenics, which will purify the human race by eliminating the undesirable. That was a scientific, modern thought, and its eventual outgrowth is horror. So what happens in this worldwide horror is that people kind of threw up their hands to say, science didn't fix it. And whether it's giving up because science didn't fix it, or stopping to trust it because science didn't fix it, or saying we have to come up with a different way to do this because science didn't fix it, that really marks the end of modernity. Where there is a philosophical rejection, societal rejection of, if we just get the math right, everything will be perfect. The problem is, technological progress does not equate with human progress. We progress, when we're healthier and stronger, and just, human nature is the same as it was. And giving me technology can improve my life in many ways, but I'm not so sure that it actually changes my humanity for good or for bad. Just might make me, healthier and longer lived, but also able to kill you quicker and faster. So, anything else? It's a real grab bag, and I'm sorry this feels kind of like we're all over the map, but I am trying my level best to cover 300 years in 45 minutes.
Not easy.
I had an aha moment when talking about frontier, the US frontier.
Yes.
And everybody was coming from all over and making little towns, and they have just one church.
Oh, sure.
And that might be why non-denominational churches came into being, because they had so many denominations.
Right. Yeah. Denominations are such a strong and in many ways very loyal, almost like a branding, but they're so identified with stuff. But then that's right, and they kind of become kind of insular. So what happens if you don't fit in that mold, or you've been burned by it? And then the answer is typically break off and do a new one.
Yeah.
And so the rise of the, what feels like millions of denominations, and even being non-denominational is in essence a denomination, but it's saying, I'm trying to remove myself from the problems that denominations have in being, insular or being kind of rigid or whatever it is. But once again, you're not really solving the problem so much as you're trading one problem for another. And not all problems are created equally, don't get me wrong, but if there is something constructive to post-modernity, and I'm not saying it's constructive in a happy sense, I think it's maybe a remembering, because I think we used to know this, that not all problems have solutions. And progress doesn't necessitate perfection. Because we can make something a little better, but it doesn't mean that we're about to make it perfect. But maybe we should just try to work on making it a little bit better, because that's not a problem that will ever go away. Even Jesus said, the poor will always be with you. I'm only here now. That's not to say you neglect the poor, but it's to say maybe that's not a problem that we can just like try a little harder and solve. Maybe our effort should be in improving it as much as possible. Okay, we good? All right. We'll see you next time then.
Okay.